Nietzsche's first major work, The Birth of Tragedy, does not begin with morality, truth, or knowledge. It begins with art. This choice is deliberate, and it reveals something fundamental about how Nietzsche understands human existence. Before people ask what is true or what is good, Nietzsche believes they find ways to endure life. Art, not reason, is the oldest response to suffering. Nietzsche rejects the idea that philosophy begins with calm reflection. He believes it begins with pain, chaos, and contradiction, with the raw fact that existence is difficult to justify. Art emerges not as decoration, but as a solution to a problem: how to affirm life despite its cruelty, randomness, and impermanence. For Nietzsche, Greek tragedy represents the highest achievement of this response. This is why Nietzsche turns to ancient Greece rather than modern Europe. He believed the Greeks faced suffering honestly. They did not hide it behind moral consolation or metaphysical promises. Instead, they transformed it into form, rhythm, and myth. Tragedy did not explain suffering away. It staged it, gave it shape, and made it bearable without denying its reality. Nietzsche saw modern culture as having lost this capacity. Where the Greeks created art that confronted life's darkness directly, modern societies preferred distraction, optimism, or moral reassurance. Art became entertainment or instruction rather than confrontation. Philosophy became argument rather than necessity. Nietzsche wanted to recover an older question: what kind of culture can say yes to life as it is? In The Birth of Tragedy, Nietzsche introduces two fundamental artistic drives, Apollo and Dionysus, not as gods to be worshipped, but as symbolic forces that shape how humans experience reality. These drives are not historical curiosities. They are psychological tendencies that exist wherever humans create meaning. By starting with art, Nietzsche makes a radical claim. Culture is not built on truth but on illusion, and that illusion is not a defect, it is a condition of survival. Without aesthetic form, life becomes unbearable. Without myth, chaos overwhelms us. The question is not whether illusion exists, but which illusions strengthen life and which weaken it. This is why Nietzsche's first book is also his most revealing. Before he critiques morality, religion, or modernity, he shows what he believes humanity needs at its core: not answers, but forms that allow suffering to be faced without denial. Art for Nietzsche is not a luxury, it is a necessity. Nietzsche names one of the two fundamental artistic drives after Apollo, the Greek god of light, form, and clarity. The Apollonian represents the human impulse to impose order on chaos, to draw boundaries, create images, and make life intelligible. It is the drive behind sculpture, epic poetry, and the dreamlike calm of beautiful appearances. For Nietzsche, the Apollonian is not simply rationality, it is the power of semblance, the ability to create stable images that protect us from the raw intensity of existence. Dreams are Nietzsche's favorite metaphor here. In dreams, we experience vivid images that feel real, yet remain safely contained. The Apollonian works in the same way. It gives us form without demanding truth in the harshest sense. This drive is essential. Without Apollonian form, human life would dissolve into chaos. We need boundaries to function, identities, narratives, concepts, and images that allow us to orient ourselves. The Apollonian creates individuality. It separates one thing from another. It says, "This is me, that is the world. This is shape, that is excess." But Nietzsche is careful. The Apollonian does not eliminate suffering, it frames it. Tragic heroes are beautiful not because they escape fate, but because their suffering is rendered intelligible and dignified through form. Apollonian art allows pain to be seen without being overwhelming. It gives suffering a face, a story, a contour. The danger arises when the Apollonian becomes dominant. When form is mistaken for reality, illusion hardens into dogma. Life becomes overly tidy, overly moralized, overly explained. Nietzsche believed modern culture leaned too heavily in this direction. We preferred clarity to depth, safety to intensity, and explanation to experience. In excess, the Apollonian becomes denial. It hides chaos beneath surface harmony. It reassures rather than confronts. This is why Nietzsche does not celebrate Apollo alone. The Apollonian is necessary, but insufficient. It keeps life stable, but it cannot make it meaningful on its own. To affirm life fully, Nietzsche believes something else is required. A force that dissolves boundaries rather than draws them, that embraces excess rather than restrains it, and that confronts suffering not through images but through immersion. That force is Dionysus. If the Apollonian gives life form, the Dionysian gives it depth. Nietzsche names this second artistic drive after Dionysus, the god of wine, ecstasy, music, and dissolution. Where Apollo creates boundaries, Dionysus breaks them. Where Apollo individualizes, Dionysus dissolves the individual into something larger, more chaotic, and more terrifying. The Dionysian represents moments when the illusion of separateness collapses, when the self is overwhelmed by intensity, rhythm, and shared experience. Music, dance, intoxication, and ritual are its primary expressions. In these states, suffering is not explained or framed. It is felt, fully and without distance. Nietzsche believed the Dionysian revealed a deeper truth about existence, that beneath all forms and identities lies a ceaseless flux of becoming, creation, and destruction. Life is not ordered at its core. It is excessive, contradictory, and indifferent to individual suffering. The Dionysian does not hide this fact. It exposes it and demands affirmation anyway. This is why Dionysian experience is both terrifying and ecstatic. It strips away the comforting illusions that protect individuality. It confronts us with mortality, impermanence, and the loss of self. But in doing so, it also dissolves isolation. The individual no longer suffers alone. Pain becomes shared, rhythmic, collective. Meaning emerges not from explanation but from participation. Nietzsche saw modern culture as deeply hostile to the Dionysian. Ecstasy, intoxication, and excess were increasingly medicalized, moralized, or suppressed. Where the Greeks had ritualized these forces, modern societies sought to regulate them. Dionysian energy did not disappear. It re-emerged in distorted forms: mass hysteria, fanaticism, and destructive excess without form. Crucially, Nietzsche did not see the Dionysian as irrational chaos to be eliminated. Without it, life becomes thin, anxious, and brittle. Cultures that suppress Dionysian forces do not become more reasonable. They become more resentful. What is denied returns in uglier forms. Yet Dionysus alone is also insufficient. Pure dissolution destroys individuality altogether. Without form, ecstasy becomes madness. Without boundaries, intensity becomes annihilation. The Dionysian must be balanced, not suppressed, but shaped. This insight leads to Nietzsche's central claim in The Birth of Tragedy. The greatest art does not choose between Apollo and Dionysus. It holds them in tension. For Nietzsche, Greek tragedy represents a rare cultural achievement, the successful fusion of Apollonian form and Dionysian depth. It is not merely theatre, and it is not entertainment. Tragedy is the artistic space in which life's most unbearable truths are confronted without denial, and yet made endurable through form. In Greek tragedy, the Apollonian appears in the visible elements: the actors, the dialogue, the narrative structure, the clearly defined heroes. These give shape to suffering. They allow the audience to see pain, fate, and loss without being overwhelmed. The tragic hero stands apart, individuated, framed by story and myth. But beneath this visible layer pulses the Dionysian. The chorus, music, rhythm, and collective experience dissolve the boundary between audience and performance. The individual spectator is drawn into something larger than themselves. The tragedy does not say, "This is his suffering." It whispers, "This is life." Nietzsche believed this combination achieved something extraordinary. Greek tragedy did not promise redemption. It did not justify suffering through moral reward or cosmic justice. Instead, it transformed suffering into something that could be affirmed. The audience left not reassured, but strengthened, not because pain was denied, but because it had been faced together. This is why Nietzsche insisted that tragedy was not pessimistic. Pessimism denies life by declaring it meaningless or unjust. Tragedy affirms life by saying, "This is what existence is, and it is still worth saying yes to." That affirmation does not come from hope or optimism, but from intensity and participation. The fusion of Apollo and Dionysus also prevented collapse into extremes. Apollonian form restrained Dionysian chaos. Dionysian depth prevented Apollonian illusion from becoming hollow. Together, they created a culture capable of enduring contradiction, a culture that did not need to escape suffering through fantasy or moralization. Nietzsche believed this tragic wisdom was fragile. It required discipline, ritual, and cultural courage. It could not survive in societies obsessed with comfort, clarity, and moral reassurance. Once either Apollo or Dionysus dominated, tragedy would die, and with it a crucial capacity to affirm life honestly. Greek tragedy, then, was not just an art form. It was a solution to the problem of existence. It showed how humans could live with suffering without lying about it, and without being destroyed by it. For Nietzsche, no later culture would match this achievement. Nietzsche believed the death of tragedy did not come from external defeat, but from an internal shift in values. That shift, he argued, began with Socrates. This claim is deliberately provocative, and Nietzsche knew it would be. Socrates is often treated as the founder of Western philosophy, reason, and ethical inquiry. Nietzsche saw him instead as a symptom of cultural imbalance. For Nietzsche, Socrates represents the moment when reason was elevated from tool to tyrant. Where Greek tragedy had held Apollo and Dionysus in tension, Socratic philosophy privileged clarity, explanation, and rational justification above all else. Life was no longer to be endured and affirmed through art, but explained and corrected through argument. Nietzsche did not accuse Socrates of dishonesty. He believed Socrates was sincere, and that this sincerity made him dangerous. Socrates believed that knowledge could cure suffering, that virtue could be taught, and that reason could master life. Nietzsche saw this as a profound misreading of the human condition. Reason, in his view, does not govern instincts, it rationalizes them after the fact. The Socratic insistence that the unexamined life is not worth living marked a turning point. Tragic wisdom had accepted that much of life is unexamined by necessity, instinctual, chaotic, and resistant to explanation. Socratic optimism replaced this with faith in dialogue, logic, and moral improvement. Suffering became a problem to be solved rather than a condition to be affirmed. Nietzsche believed this shift appealed to a particular psychological type. Socrates was physically unattractive, socially marginal, and hostile to aristocratic Greek culture. Nietzsche interpreted his elevation of reason as compensation, a way for the weak to dominate the strong by redefining virtue. Argument replaced excellence, cleverness replaced nobility, rationality became moral superiority. This is not a historical verdict so much as a psychological one. Nietzsche was less interested in whether Socrates was right or wrong than in what kind of life required Socratic values to prevail. In his view, Greek culture had become tired. Tragedy demanded strength, reason promised control, the latter won. Once reason became supreme, art lost its metaphysical role. Music, myth, and ritual were demoted to entertainment or instruction. Philosophy replaced tragedy as the cultural center. And with that replacement, Nietzsche believed, Western culture began a long drift toward denial, explaining life instead of affirming it. Socrates, then, is not a villain in Nietzsche's story. He is a turning point, a sign that the balance had tipped and that the tragic wisdom capable of saying yes to life without consolation was giving way to a culture that demanded justification before affirmation. For Nietzsche, tragedy did not die because audiences lost interest or because artists lost talent. It died because the conditions that made it possible disappeared. Once Socratic reason became dominant, the tragic worldview could no longer survive. A culture that demands explanation before affirmation cannot tolerate tragedy for long. Tragedy requires the courage to face suffering without resolving it. It refuses to justify pain through moral reward, rational progress, or cosmic fairness. But Socratic culture insists that suffering must have a reason, a cause that can be identified, corrected, or eliminated. Where tragedy says, "This is life," reason asks, "How do we fix it?" Nietzsche believed this shift reflected a deeper anxiety. As cultures weaken, they lose the capacity to endure contradiction. They begin to fear chaos, excess, and ambiguity. Rational explanation becomes a form of defense. Logic, clarity, and moral certainty promise control where strength has diminished. Tragedy, by contrast, demands acceptance without control, and that demand becomes intolerable. As Socratic optimism spread, art was reshaped to serve reason. Drama became moral instruction, music became accompaniment, myth became allegory. What once functioned as a metaphysical response to existence was reduced to pedagogy. Art no longer justified life, it explained it. Nietzsche believed this was not progress, but substitution. Reason did not solve the problem tragedy addressed, it displaced it. Suffering did not disappear, it was reinterpreted. Instead of being affirmed through shared ritual and aesthetic intensity, it was moralized, psychologized, or medicalized. This is why Nietzsche saw modern culture as post-tragic. We still experience suffering, but we lack forms that allow us to confront it honestly. We explain it, manage it, or distract ourselves from it. Tragedy required participation. Modern culture prefers spectatorship. The death of tragedy also explains Nietzsche's hostility toward moral optimism. Cultures that believe suffering can be eliminated inevitably treat those who fail to thrive as problems to be solved. Tragic cultures accept that suffering is inseparable from existence. They do not ask how to remove it. They ask how to live with it without lying. For Nietzsche, the disappearance of tragedy marked the beginning of a long cultural decline. Not because reason is evil, but because reason was asked to do what it cannot. It cannot make life meaningful on its own. When it tries, it produces shallow optimism, moralism, and denial. Tragedy died when explanation replaced affirmation. And once it died, Western culture forgot how to say yes to life without conditions. Nietzsche did not write The Birth of Tragedy as a work of classical scholarship. He wrote it as a diagnosis of modern culture, one that he believed remained unfinished. The opposition between Apollo and Dionysus is not confined to ancient Greece. It describes a tension that exists wherever human beings try to make life bearable. Nietzsche believed modern societies had inherited the Socratic faith in reason without recognizing its limits. We explain more than any culture before us, yet feel less meaning. We analyze suffering endlessly, yet struggle to endure it. We replace ritual with therapy, myth with ideology, and tragedy with entertainment. The result is not clarity, but fragility. The loss Nietzsche identified is not the loss of art, but the loss of tragic wisdom, the capacity to face suffering without demanding that it be justified, solved, or redeemed. Modern culture, Nietzsche believed, is deeply uncomfortable with this. We want reasons, we want causes, we want guarantees. When these fail, we turn to moral outrage, resentment, or distraction. This is why Nietzsche believed Dionysian energy does not disappear when suppressed. It returns in distorted forms: mass hysteria, ideological fanaticism, and collective intoxication without form. When cultures deny depth, depth erupts destructively. When suffering cannot be affirmed, it seeks expression through excess. At the same time, Nietzsche did not advocate a return to chaos. He did not want to abolish reason or dissolve all structure. His claim was more demanding. Life requires both form and depth. Apollo without Dionysus becomes sterile. Dionysus without Apollo becomes destructive. The challenge is not choosing one, but sustaining their tension. For Nietzsche, this tension was not merely aesthetic, it was existential. A culture that cannot hold contradiction becomes brittle. An individual who cannot endure intensity without explanation becomes resentful. Tragic art once trained human beings to live with uncertainty, pain, and impermanence without denial. Its disappearance left a vacuum that morality and ideology rushed to fill. This is why the birth of tragedy remains relevant. It is not about ancient theatre. It is about what kind of culture can say yes to life without lying about it. Nietzsche's answer is not comforting. It demands strength, discipline, and the courage to face existence without guarantees. The question he leaves us with is the same one that will return throughout this series. Can we affirm life as it is, not because it is fair or meaningful, but because it is ours?